Does the Bible describe God commanding and commending of the Israelites actions which, by contemporary legal definition, would be considered genocide? That's the question I want to consider in this video. My interlocutor, or my foil in this video, will be a 45-second excerpt from an interview that Sean McDowell did with a professor at Biola University named Charlie Trimm. In the excerpt we'll look at, Dr. Trimm argues that, in fact, those actions described by the Israelites and commanded by God in the Old Testament do not qualify as genocide. So we'll play the video and then I'll offer my response. Now, let me just say at the outset, my apologies for the relatively bad video quality here. Sound should be good, but this is the kind of video you get when you're on Twitter. So we'll just play it now.
The argument I make in an article that's coming out in a genocide studies book about the ancient Near East is that the heart definition of genocide doesn't really fit the ancient Near East. So genocide is not just about numbers. It's not about killing X number of people. It's about killing a group of people because of something about their identity. So maybe it's race, ethnicity, religion, something along those lines. And you don't really have that in the ancient Near East. You don't have, say, the Assyrians coming in and killing a group because they're a different religion or because they're different ethnicity. They will conquer people because they don't give them money or because they have rebelled, but it's not in the sense of genocide in modern terms. And so I don't think in the ancient Near East you have something that fits the modern term of genocide.
Okay, so that's the video. Now we will, now what I'm going to do is look at a definition, the definition of genocide that is accepted by the United Nations, and then we'll just proceed from there. All right, here's our definition of genocide. This comes from the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which was the first official UN position. Interesting story about how this came about in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Genocide Convention was really the fruit of the efforts of Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish man who had survived the concentration camps of World War II and believed that there needed to be encoded within international law a recognition for the unique crime that was undertaken at the time. So reading from Article 2, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So a couple of things then with that in mind. The first thing I wanted to talk about with respect to what Dr. Trimm said is, he says, well, genocide isn't just about killing numbers of people, it's about killing them because you want to destroy the ethnic identity. And I would just want to qualify that in an important way. Genocide doesn't actually necessarily involve killing at all, because it's not about destroying individual human lives. The purpose of genocide, what makes it a unique crime against humanity, is that it seeks to eradicate the ethnic, religious, national, or cultural identity as such. Now that could involve, obviously, killing off all members of the group that have that national or religious or cultural identity. But it could also involve other actions. Look at D, for example, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Let's say that there was an indigenous group that you wanted to destroy. And what you did, as you being the malevolent government, is that you secretly put contraceptives into their water supply, which inhibited births in the women. And then over several decades, the women became largely infertile, and this social group or this ethnic group died out. That group may never have been aware that they were subjects of genocide. They may have simply thought that they had a big problem with infertility in their group. And yet, the actions, even though you never killed anyone, by bringing about infertility within the group to the end of destroying the ethnic or cultural or religious identity, that would qualify as genocide. Look at E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So what's going on there? Well, here's an example from Canadian history that throughout the 20th century, there was something called the residential schools. The residential school system existed until 1996. And it was the case where the national government, the federal government, would work with religious groups, Catholic and Protestant, to run state-run schools. And children would be taken from Indigenous First Nations communities and forcibly removed from their families and their communities and put into these residential schools where they would learn proper Canadian culture and language with, in part, the intent of destroying their connections with their First Nations Indigenous cultural background and language. It was, in short, an attempt at genocide, an attempt at the destruction of the Indigenous culture itself. And so the 60s scoop, which was part of this whole sad story of Canadian history, and the history of the residential schools is a history of genocide. So that's what genocide is. It's much more than killing, which Dr. Trimm does not make clear. Now, with that in mind, should we think about the actions in ancient Israel as being undertaken, being actions that would qualify as genocide by contemporary definition? Well, let's take a look at some of those passages that are relevant. So reading here in Deuteronomy chapter 20, starting at verse 10, when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people of it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves and use the plunder the Lord gives you from your enemies. Okay, so here's the scenario for this first group of peoples that are living far away from the land. The Israelites will attack them, and if they do not automatically surrender and become slaves of the Israelites, subject to forced labor, if they don't agree to that, then all the men will be slaughtered, and the women and children will be incorporated into Israelite society. That definitely would qualify as genocide, because you're taking an entire national group or identity here, and you're either forcing them to subjecting them to forced labor, or you're slaughtering all the men if they don't agree to forced labor, and then making all the women and children slaves within the society. That certainly, it at least would very plausibly be a case to be considered by The Hague in the International Criminal Court as an instance of genocide. But if we read then on from verse 16, it gets even more overt with the nearby nations. In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. Two things to be highlighted here. The first thing is that often people who say this is not genocide, actually three things. So the first thing they will say is, well, completely destroy, this is hyperbolic, this is exaggerated language. They wouldn't literally destroy every single one. But of course, even if that is hyperbolic and it doesn't literally require the slaughter of every single living thing that breathes, it nonetheless is, the hyperbole is sufficient to warrant the case of genocide. If you're invading a country and you say slaughter wantonly, destroy them wantonly, but you express that command through the hyperbolic description of kill every living one of them, that again would qualify as genocide. You're going in, you're attacking the Canaanites just as such. You're attacking the Amorites just as such. Now, the other thing, the second thing is that, well, defenders of the passage, or this reading of the passage, such as Dr. Trimm is giving, will say, oh, but in verse 18, it doesn't say kill them because of their Canaanite identity. It says kill them because they're worshiping other gods. That's why you have to slaughter them. Well, that doesn't mean that it's not genocide. And this is one of the critical problems people miss here, is that throughout history, genocides have always been justified by some sort of rhetorical reasoning, so some kind of justification, some ad hoc account. So for example, it wasn't really that the Nazis were saying we have to kill the Jews just because they're Jews. No, we kill the Jews because they are dangerous, because they are parasites on society, because they're not fully human, because they've been stealing from us for centuries. And that is why you justify the genocide. So the fact that you say, well, we have to slaughter them because they are worshiping other gods and will lead us astray, that is just one more rationalization to justify the genocide. It doesn't mean it's not genocide. Now, one more thing to keep in mind here is that defenders of this reading of this passage, like Dr. Trimm, will often say, but there's also common language throughout the passage of driving them out of the land. In fact, the language of driving them out of the land is more frequent than the language of killing them all. That as well doesn't mean it's not genocide. It would mean that it's also ethnic cleansing, because ethnic cleansing is another legal concept where you remove from the land a particular national, racial, or ethnic group. But keep in mind that anybody that is not driven out of the land, that remains behind, they would be slaughtered, they would be killed. And that is expressly the statement here. And so if you have the military actions undertaken by one group against another group, which involves driving them out of the land and killing everyone that remains and destroying their cultural implements, that is genocide. That is clearly an example of genocide. Next, we can go to Numbers 31. Just take a look here from verse 15. Moses is incredulous against the actions of the army because they allowed the women of the Midianites to live. So then he goes on and says, kill all the boys, kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Remember Boko Haram? Does this sound a little bit like Boko Haram? I mean, imagine if this happened today, that there's a group comes in, invades a village, kills every woman in the village who is not a virgin, kills all the men, all the boys, and keeps all the virgin girls for the army. What would you think in that case? It would certainly be another candidate, at the very least, for investigation as a crime against humanity and a genocide in The Hague. And of course, it's a few other things beside that. Keep in mind that there is, among other things, the infliction of psychological terror upon populations. Imagine that you're a 15 or 14-year-old girl that has just watched your 12-year-old brother, your mother, and your father cut to pieces, and you are now given over to an Israelite soldier. What does that look like, do you think? Is that something that you want to justify? And I mean, does it really help if you're saying, well, but does that legally meet the definition of genocide? Well, there are several other crimes against humanity that would be considered as well. Last, we'll just take a brief look at 1 Samuel 15:3. God commands, through Samuel speaking to Saul, go attack the Amalekites, totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them, put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Again, an entire group here, the Amalekites, is literally being consigned to destruction. Now, yes, there are Amalekites described later on in the Bible, so it appears like we do not have every Amalekite killed here. That does not mean that that which is being described in 1 Samuel 15:3 does not qualify as a genocide. It clearly does. So look, I think that when you look at the definition of genocide from the United Nations, and then you look at the natural reading of these passages, Deuteronomy 20, Numbers 31, 1 Samuel 15, what you clearly have are several actions that would constitute genocide, ethnic cleansing, and other war crimes or crimes against humanity. So then the next question is simply this. Do you want to justify those? Because if you do, then what you're saying is you're committed to the view that those actions are by definition not wrong, or not by definition wrong, that there are justified instances where there can be acts of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and other war crimes or crimes against humanity. And then if in the Old Testament, perhaps at other times in history, perhaps in the New Testament. In fact, people often want to say, well, they want to keep those actions to the Old Testament and say, but God doesn't command that anymore. Yeah, but there's no verse that says that. there's no verse that says God once commanded genocide and ethnic cleansing, but God will not do that anymore. That is a hopeful reading into the Bible and into the implications of Jesus. And it is a pretty interesting fact about history that there have been several points throughout Christian quote unquote history in which those passages and others have been used to justify various actions that would constitute genocide by contemporary definition. So to summarize, I recognize it was a 45-second clip that I was responding to, and there is an hour-long interview to listen to. So if you want to check Dr. Trimm's interview with Miss Dr. Dr. McDowell, I would, I said Dr. Sheen, Dr. McDowell, I would encourage you to listen to the whole interview, hear what he has to say, but I am going to say that it seems to me quite clear that those actions do indeed constitute genocide.